The meteoric rise of New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani illustrates one thing. It's this: affordability, or a lack thereof, has energized young voters. Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. But that's not the only term voters and politicians are buzzing about. Mamdani is also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. What does that even mean in 2025? For more on all things Mamdani and what it might mean for the party that lost control of all three branches of government in the 2024 elections, I'm now joined by USA Today chief political correspondent Phillip M. Bailey. It's good to have you here, Phillip.
Hey, Dana, how are you?
Phillip, when we talk about Republicans and Democrats, it's not uncommon to refer to the hard right or the far left. Are there similar distinctions with Democratic Socialists? How does Mamdani describe or define his political beliefs?
When we ask people about Zohran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York City, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and about really socialism, democratic socialism as a whole, it really depends on who you talk to and who you ask. But there are we should establish this, some clear lines of demarcation on what democratic socialism is. And generally speaking, it is defined as a belief that the economy should be democratically run for the benefit of the public, that there are basic human rights like housing and healthcare that society, often meaning the government, should provide. That is very different than free market capitalism, which has really fueled American innovation, invention, and is a system that we've been running under for the most part for most of this country's history. Although there are some elements of socialism, democratic socialist members would point out, within American democracy, within our economy. So look, when you talk to someone like Mike Gonzalez from the Heritage Foundation, he is adamant how he views Zohran Mamdani. Someone from the right, he views him as a communist. He's not a communist. Communism is that authoritarian system. But when you talk to more centrist-minded Democrats, they're not necessarily saying they're opposed to Zohran Mamdani, but they're just thinking a lot of his ideas aren't really feasible. So this is going to be a test across the board in 2026. I think that both parties are betting on will galvanize voters. All agree, the voters we talked to, whether they were more Republican leaning or Democratic leaning, all agree that affordability is going to be at the center. And I think that's why you see more socialist minded, more democratic socialist minded candidates, whether in New York or other parts of this country, really beginning to take off.
Some of Mamdani's beliefs are clearly resonating with younger Americans. Phillip, I know that you took a look specifically at younger voters. For those who supported Mamdani, is this a moment about embracing democratic socialism, or is it about being fed up with capitalism?
Zohran Mamdani, in his very popular campaign, which took advantage of social media, which took advantage of the wave and his sort of charisma, he always had a smiling face. He never really talked about himself as a socialist. He talked about affordability. He talked about the rising cost, how it's just ridiculous how much things cost in New York City, particularly for a lot of younger Americans who are having a hard time, Dana, getting a foothold in the American economy. So he didn't wear a T-shirt saying, "I am a democratic socialist," but he did talk about tenets of his beliefs and how certain things around free buses, city-run grocery stores. He talked about gender-affirming care as a belief of his. He also did a recent rally with the Reverend Al Sharpton and talked about his support for diversity, equity, inclusion. It's very much in the opposite direction that Donald Trump has been taking Washington and the rest of the country. But what voters across the board are saying, and polling shows, is that there is a waning support of capitalism, a waning belief that capitalism is the best system for America moving forward. And we see that in a Gallup survey that found, 54% of Americans, US adults, still overall hold a positive view of capitalism, but that's down compared to 60% 4 years ago. And I think that's because a younger group of voters who are coming in, it's harder for them to get in the economy. And Zohran Mamdani and other socialists are saying, hey, look, some of these things that these donors, that these capitalists, that these owners of society don't care about, we care about, and we want to make them more affordable for you. Whether or not he can do that will be the big test for him going into his governance part of his political life starting on January 1st.
Let's dig into America's cost crisis. In the aftermath of Mamdani's win, President Donald Trump latched on to the issue of affordability. What's Trump's take here?
Well, I think the president, one thing we can say is that he is never opaque in his statements. He straight up calls, Mamdani a lunatic communist, right? And he has pledged that he is, New York City is his hometown. He no longer lives there. He lives technically in in Florida, although he's residing in the White House. But he's made it very clear as a fixture of New York, he did not want Zohran Mamdani to win. His administration was involved, some would say, bribing former mayor or soon to be former mayor Eric Adams, who eventually dropped out of the race. Donald Trump warmed up to Andrew Cuomo, a Democrat who ran as an independent after losing that primary. So he's made it very clear that he is going to try to make things very, very difficult for Zohran Mamdani. And Mamdani himself basically issued a challenge to President Trump during his victory speech, saying, "Mr. President, if you're watching, turn the volume up," like threatening him, almost saying, "I dare you to do more harm to New York, our immigrants, and other folks in the city who disagree with your policies." So I think, Donald Trump is going to make life very difficult for Zohran Mamdani. The question is, will others close ranks around him, officials in New York, both Democrats and maybe even a few moderate Republicans who may say this is the purview of the mayor and the president shouldn't make it more difficult for him. We're all waiting to see that. But for the country, I think what we're going to see is this Rorschach test about democratic socialism. Will it work in places like Kansas City, Missouri? Will it work in Jacksonville, Florida? Will it work in Austin, Texas? And how will more rural voters who are maybe not as enthusiastic as they were last year about Donald Trump have not seen this drastic reduction in prices, a booming economy? The economy is still doing fairly well, but it's not necessarily humming the way that Donald Trump promised a year ago. So as his voters begin to be more skeptical of him, will that energize the left with their own version of populism? Uh, right now, Zohran Mamdani's approval numbers are pretty low according to Republicans nationally, but I think you are already seeing in races across this country, the mayor's race in Seattle, for example, the Democratic Socialist candidate prevailed in that race, beating a long-time incumbent, right? So we're already seeing the fruits of the Zohran Mamdani seeds that were planted over the summer uh, blooming here in the fall already.
I wanted to ask, what did some Trump-leaning voters tell USA Today about how the president is doing on the issue of affordability?
Yeah, we had a chance to talk to voters across the country. This is one of my favorite parts of the job, where you get to talk to average people, not the experts, not the politicians, but just average Americans. There was one younger Republican voter who I think, to me at least, really stood out. A 24-year-old kid out of Alabama. And he and I spoke at length about what's going on right now. And with Gray Holland, that Republican voter I spoke with, again, 24-year-old sales rep out of Birmingham, he talked about, look, I'm not necessarily happy with where the economy is going, but I'm not a socialist. He doesn't personally blame capitalism for the failures of the economy, but he does believe that capitalism, like other institutions and ideologies, can be corrupted. And he talked at length about how there are problems with how capitalism is operating. He did vote for Donald Trump last year. He is not a big fan of Trump currently. So he's really looking for your more America first, more MAGA oriented Republicans to take charge of this moment. Will that mean parting ways with Donald Trump? We're already seeing, for example, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene out of Georgia buck the GOP a whole lot more. Is there a future for the GOP beyond Donald Trump, even as his supporters or diehard supporters flirt with the unconstitutional idea of third term? And what Gray, conveyed to me is that he's looking for someone on the right to really pick up that populist mantle that Trump did last year and continue it. Whether that's someone like a Senator Josh Hawley, who he mentioned out of Missouri, who's been more talking about poor people and working class folks. So younger conservatives aren't necessarily going full blown socialists, but they are acknowledging, right, in conversation that look, capitalism isn't really the best thing that's going on right now. Doesn't mean we want to turn our back on it, but it does mean that these politicians need to pay attention to what younger voters, particularly those in the 18 to 26 range, I think in particular, those young Gen Z voters, how they're feeling about the economy, Dana, because they're not just competing again with a bad economy, other workers, foreign workers, etc. They're also now competing with artificial intelligence.
We're still parsing the end of the recent 43-day government shutdown, the winners and losers. But how did young progressives feel about the way the shutdown ended?
From those we spoke with, I mean, look, there's a large amount of disappointment in how Democrats ultimately handled the 8 Democrats who made that compromise with the Republicans on the shutdown. Historically speaking, shutdowns are not good for Democrats. They are the party that has a little more belief in government dependency. than Republicans do oftentimes, or at least for working people and working poor people. So in that regard, I think that the pressure was always on Democrats, but there is a large amount of disappointment and anger, particularly aimed at Chuck Schumer and his inability to keep the minority caucus in the Senate together. It didn't come up as much around the Zohran Mandani, but I do think that the two are connected in that there's two things happening at the same time. There's this affordability crisis, the rising cost of basic things, right? Affording a house, student loan debt, etc. And there's also this feeling that look, current Democrats just aren't up for the fight. That there needs to be a changing of the guard. And that was what dominated, I think, and maybe hampered former Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign for those 107 days. And we're already seeing, at least visually, the transition. Nancy Pelosi, the longtime stalwart liberal lion of the House, former House Speaker, she's now retiring as Zohran Mamdani is emerging. And this is, I think, the point that NRCC and other Republicans are going to make is that, look, the Democrats are going even further to the left. You thought Nancy Pelosi was liberal. Wait till you get a hold of Zohran Mamdani, the socialist. But for progressives, I think, it's not necessarily a love of the Democratic Party, but there's this acknowledgement that Trump runs Washington, and for Democrats, at least in their smaller races, have to go with maybe the more progressive contender. This is going to be an ongoing debate, Dana, within Democratic ranks because, yes, Zohran Mamdani won with 50% of the vote, but people like Mickey Sherrill in New Jersey and Abigail Spanberger in Virginia won, and they didn't run as socialists. They ran as kitchen table centrists. So that debate's going to be ongoing for Democrats as well in 2026.
Philip, did you get a sense of swelling optimism with younger voters in the aftermath of Mamdani's win? Are they satisfied with just seeing the message of affordability getting through, or do they have high expectations for his ability to govern?
I don't think it's the same scale as Barack Obama's win in 2008, but I do see the automatic comparisons, right? Younger people, this outsider candidate who wasn't really well known up until a certain point, this, now 34-year-old New York assemblyman with a funny name, right? Coming from a different, more diverse background, has these sort of left of center beliefs. I think Zohran Mamdani is owning it a whole lot more than 2007, 2008 Barack Obama did. So there is a similarity in that excitement, right? But there's also, I think, a realization that Zohran Mamdani, what works in New York, doesn't necessarily work in Missouri, doesn't necessarily work in Texas or Colorado. So there's this acknowledgement, and I talked to Ken Martin, the DNC chairman, about this. That I think Democrats are returning to this big tent philosophy. That the way a candidate behaves in West Virginia as a Democrat is going to be very different than the way one behaves in New York City, and they have to kind of let each other express themselves as they see fit. But I think for leftists, right, for people who are considered on the hard left or far left, I do think that at the local level they are somewhat encouraged. When you look again at the results in Seattle, where you saw the Democratic Socialist aligned candidate there, Katie Wilson, a 43-year-old Democratic Socialist aligned candidate who was not as charismatic as Zohran Mamdani, but she pulled out that victory.
Of course, this year's elections now give way to the run-up to next year's midterms. Has Mamdani handed Democrats a winning platform and playbook here, or is it too soon to tell?
I think it's too soon to tell if he's given them a winning playbook, right? Like, I don't think, for example, in Seattle, which is a very different city and a very different race, I don't think that, Katie Wilson was modeling herself after Zohran Mamdani, right? Didn't have his charisma, but was much more of a policy wonk. I do think that what Mamdani is doing is that he's giving the Democratic Party the energy boost that it needs. Right, that adrenaline rush, right? People now are aware. They're seeing him in the phone. Whether they're seeing the hate against him or the love for him, they're seeing him in their phones. He's appearing on their feeds. He's on their television. He's on their laptop screens, etc., wherever they might go to get information. So that's important. A party that consistently this year has been on the rebuild and the rebound. Poll after poll, survey after survey shows that voters are not happy with the Democratic Party. They think it's a weak party, think it's a bad brand, and any of their wins are largely attributed to a backlash against Donald Trump more than a love of Democrats. Donald Trump did this 10 years ago. He introduced a whole new group of voters and brought them into the Republican Party who really felt that Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and the like were all kind of stale. So he used his reality TV star background and brought in a whole new group of voters, and it remade the Republican Party. Is Zohran Mamdani and others doing the exact same thing on the left. Certainly his critics on the right feel the DSA is zombifying and body snatching the Democratic Party. But on a positive spin, I do think that you're seeing maybe a new group of voters who are being introduced to Democrats who may not like the Democratic Party as is. So when you introduce these new voters, we're going to see this, I think, in some of these primaries for Congress play out, particularly in some of these deep blue districts, but some of these swing districts as well, where we're going to see maybe younger or newer Democrats, people running under the Democratic banner, approaching this and saying, I don't like Chuck Schumer. One of my first tests, Dana, for this is going to be, where do these candidates stand if the Democrats take back the House on Hakeem Jeffries being Speaker of the House? He certainly is a person who'd be in line for that. He was reluctant to endorse Zohran Mamdani. He is often associated with sort of the establishment face of the Democratic Party and its more corporate donors. If we start seeing more of those candidates drift away from Jeffries, that tells me that, yeah, we're on a clear pivot that could impact not just 2026, but even 2028 for Democrats.
Phillip Bailey is USA Today chief political correspondent. Thank you so much for joining me, Phillip.
Dana, as always, thank you.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.